Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and this is Plant Reproduction Part 2. So to start this off, let's review the parts of a flower. So if we want to take the male parts first, well actually let's start very down here at the bottom. You've got the sepal, which are the protective leaves that surround the flower. You've got the petals, then obviously that are involved in attracting pollinators. You've got the filament that holds up the anther, and the anther will be where the pollen will be produced. Together, those are called the stamen. And then you've got the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule, which all goes together to be called the carpel, sometimes called the pistil. So don't be confused by that. If you look at all of the stamens at one time, you're looking at a plant that we call as androecium. If you're looking at all the carpels at one time, then we call that gynoecium. If you're looking at all of the petals, that's the corolla. And if you're looking at just the sepals, that's called the calyx. So you might want to review those terms in your book and go back and look at those. So if let's go a little bit further in our review and look at the gametophytes in the flower. So now we're looking at, here's an anther. Cross section of the anther is the pollen sac. Inside the pollen sac you find the microspores, which are the mother cells, so to speak. And these are the sporophyte. Well, actually the sporophyte is here, the pollen sac, and then the spores that are produced in that here, the microspore in this case, will then go through meiosis and produce the pollen grains inside of that will actually be released to produce the sperm. In the female side, you have the ovule, and in the ovule you'll have the megaspore female. This is the megaspore, which will produce through meiosis the egg cells, as well as the cells like the polar nuclei that will be involved in double fertilization. So then you've got here the egg, the polar nuclei, and this egg sac that surrounds it ready to be fertilized. And of course double fertilization will take place, and you'll have the polar nuclei fertilized to produce the endosperm, the egg cell to produce will be fertilized to produce the embryo. So it's a very interesting process that takes place here. Of course both of these sperm cells will be released down into the plant, this one to create the tube, and then the two sperm following down that tube. Very cool the way it happened. And then, of course, for this process to happen, some flowers need pollination to take place. So what is pollination? It's a process by which pollen is placed on the stigma. There are pollinators that help in that process for those that can't do it on their own. And those pollinators would be organisms like insects and birds and other animals that transfer pollen between plants and of the same species. Now, this could even be, you're considered an animal at times. If you've ever walked through a field and picked up, you've probably picked up some pollen from flowers if you've brushed up against them. If you've ever maybe brushed up against a flower, even at like a grocery store, if they have a floral department, and you may end up with pollen on your hands. It's actually really hard to get off sometimes because of the sticky nature of it. It's quite interesting the way it works. How do flowers change morphology based on pollination? Well, this is an evolutionary process that you can look at in the change of plants. So you've got early seed plants and wind pollination, a path that many present-day conifers take today because it is so effective. It works pretty well. You can also you can travel through wind alone about 100 meters, so you get good distance with it. That's pretty decent. You may be you must be close to work, but 100 meters is still a pretty good distance to travel. So wind has been effective in moving pollen from one plant to the next. 100 meters, you could easily go a distance that separates you from plant A to plant B. But that is also a negative in that you have to be pretty close still to each other to really work. So there could be a reason for an evolutionary adaptation to take place here, because you've got, although it's effective, you've got a distance that could be an issue. So then you get into flowers and animal pollinators and how they have co-evolved. So you get the evolution of using an insect or a bird or something like that, And then you have this coevolution process that takes place. As the flower has to adapt to the organism, then the organism changes some, the flower has to change with it. The most numerous groups of plants and insects is bees. Most bees visit blue or yellow flowers with stripes or dots, and that's one of the reasons why if you look at a lot of wild flowers, you end up with either yellow or blue wildflowers and flowers that have stripes and dots on them, and that's because that attracts those bees. So over time, the flowers have adapted to what attracts the bees the most. Obviously, that would be the ones that reproduce the most. Natural selection would say they are more fitted for the environment, or more fit for the environment, and they would be the ones that would produce more offspring, and that is the case when you look in nature. Butterflies and moths are also frequent pollinators. They often have long cylinder floral tubes filled with nectar because that's what they're coming to get from the plant, and they have these big sucking mouth parts to get down in that flower and suck that nectar out. So the flower has adapted these long tubes so that the butterfly actually has to land and get down in that flower to get that nectar out. If it's not very deep, then it could possibly suck the nectar out without ever hitting the anther or the stigma. So there's been an evolutionary adaptation of creating that longer tube so that they have to get down in that flower and thus transfer the pollen. Usually they're heavily scented for location at night, and you've probably you can smell flowers just by walking in a room. If there's fresh flowers in there, you usually know it. Birds help pollinate primarily red flowers that aren't seen well by insects, so you'll specialize with birds. And if you see a lot of red flowers, what you'll probably notice is birds will be around them, pollinating them more than insects. Other animals like bats, small rodents, and monkeys can help too, and that can change the flower's adaptation. I continue to look at wind pollination. Wind pollination has also been adapted for in organisms like oak, birch, cottonwood, grass, sedges, and nettles. Their flowers are small, greenish, and odorless with reduced or absent corollas, meaning there's no petals. And I actually have one of these in my backyard, and sure enough, when you produce the flower, it looks like this. Okay, these long hanging, this is actually stigmas that are there for the flower when the wind's blowing, the pollen to stick to it. So they hang in the wind like this, and the wind blows, and it allows that pollen to stick to those stigmas. And here you have, of course, the anther, and up here ready to be blown, let that pollen go when the wind blows. Here's another example. This is corn, and you can see it hangs out that top part there, ready for wind to come by and blow it all around. So you have some adaptation to wind, even though you would say evolutionarily you should have gotten away from wind because you get more advantage with insects and birds, but you also have to put more evolutionarily into that because you're having to attract those organisms to come pollinate. So there's evolutionary advantages and disadvantages to both. When would self-pollination be favored? Sometimes we think of this as a negative with humans. It's a crazy concept, but in plants, you could have a favor to self-pollination. You don't have to attract a pollinator, so you don't have to worry about trying to attract an insect or a bird or something like that that's actually taking resources away from you. You don't have to worry about wind, and if the wind doesn't blow much this year, whether you get to reproduce, stuff like that. You're able to contain it all inside of a structure where it will reproduce. Now, due to meiosis, they're not identical to the parent, but they share enough favorable traits that that make it successful in the environment. So this is still sexual reproduction, even though it's self-pollinating, and that's sometimes hard to understand. But you've got to remember that meiosis is producing those gametes. So you still got two gametes coming together that are not identical because of meiosis. So we consider that sexual reproduction. How has evolution favored outcrossing? Outcrossing, of course, is reproducing with something else in the environment. So evolution has favored that because you obviously get more variation. And plants have adapted to that. You have separation of stamen and pistils. Usually pistils are higher than the stamen. So if the part that's sticky is high and the pollen is low, when that insect comes in, and it picks up that pollen, as it's flying away, it doesn't hit the stigma. As it's coming in, it will hit the stigma. So it's allowed the evolution then of not reproducing with the same flower. And then you've also got self-incompatibility. You can see that here in this picture. There's self-incompatibility genes. So if the pollen, which is haploid, has the gene that is shared by the stigma, which is diploid, and it only has to have one of those in common, then it won't allow that stigma, that pollen tube, to grow down. If by chance that pollen has a different gene than the stigma, then it will allow it to grow down. In this case here, you've got self-incompatibility where neither one of these is going to make it because they're both incompatible. So that's an adaptation to keep self-pollination from happening. Last thing here is what plants would evolutionarily benefit from asexual reproduction. Relatively unchanging environments. Agriculture and horticulture, that's something that we use a lot there. Apomixis, the embryos and seeds, may be produced asexually from the plant, the parent plant. You see this in some plants, not a ton. In like bananas, you'll see asexual reproduction. This is really where you get budding developing. So a little baby tree will start growing beside the big parent tree, and that tree is actually identical. It's asexual reproduction, identical to the parent. In essence, it's a clone, and you can cut that and take it and plant it in another area. So if the environment's fairly consistent, if it's encouraged through human interaction like agriculture and horticulture, then you're able to survive well without having to have any evolutionary adaptation to something different. And then what are various lifespans for plants? You have perennial plants that continue to grow year after year and may be herbaceous or woody. Of course, this is a lot of your trees and stuff like that. Annual plants grow, flower, form fruits and seeds within one growing season and die when the process is complete. And then biennial plants have life cycles that take 2 years to complete. So you'll have a growth year, and then you'll have a flower year that will produce a seed, and then it will die. So you've got 3 different life cycles there that wraps up plants for us.